So Harun has asked me today to talk just a very kind of basic overview of kind of an introduction to qualitative methods. It's a very short session, so I only really have time to kind of give a taster of some of the kind of power and some of the utility that you can get from taking a qualitative approach. Sorry, let me check my microphone. Can you hear me okay? Is that better now?
Dr. Turner, I think this is better.
That's better? Good.
Yeah,
Good.
that's right.
Sorry about that. Thank you. So it's going to be a very brief overview, but I'm going to try and link to a couple of publications and a couple of other resources, including a blog that I write, which will have a lot more detail on these topics. So if you've heard anything that's intriguing to you today, then feel free to follow up with more detail in those particular resources. And also obviously have time for questions at the end. So should be able to, yeah, let you know how if there's anything you want me to cover further. So I'm going to look a little bit at design, but also the methods and analysis in social science research, but also quite a big thing is why you would choose a qualitative approach. So my own background is mostly in qualitative research, although I've also done mixed methods research, so integrating qualitative and quantitative approaches. And that's a very powerful combination, because I think a lot of people are more familiar with quantitative methods, but there are a lot of questions that quantitative methods can't answer or can't explain in enough detail, especially for kind of complex and what sometimes called wicked issues. So my background came from as a qualitative researcher, and then my colleagues and I got kind of frustrated with the software tools which were there to help us work with qualitative data. And we've designed quercus as a new tool to help people work with qualitative text data. So that's my own background. And again, I'm extremely honored to be asked to talk to you again. So the first question really, I guess, is what is qualitative research? What does that mean? It's a group of a whole bunch of different paradigms, a group of different ontologies. And it's about, for me, it's about essentially getting to a deep level of understanding. So it's where you have a research question which is very difficult to quantify, or you have a research question where it's really difficult to understand the rationale and the reasoning behind the findings that you're finding from a quantitative approach. That's where qualitative research can be very beneficial. There are a lot of different methods that you can use for qualitative analysis, and we'll talk about some of those very briefly, and how we can bring those together. And we'll also look at some examples of those methods. And then we'll look also in a little bit more depth as to how we analyze qualitative data, because I often find that most people have at least heard of some of the qualitative methods. They have some level of familiarization. Most people can imagine how that they're used. But when it comes to the analysis, it's such a very different step if you're used to analyzing quantitative data, that I want to explain a little bit about some of the different ways in which we can analyze qualitative data. So the different qualitative approaches that we can use. So the quantitative approaches, they tend to be a couple of things. I'll put these all up now. So they are things which can be directly measurable. So something where it's very easy to count or quantify, and that could be something like the number of people doing a particular approach, using a particular service, and things which are designed to be quantified. So for example, satisfaction scores. Now satisfaction with something, so say a service, that could be something which is actually quite a qualitative measure. How we feel about something varies a lot from individual, and there's a lot of nuances in how people express that. But we very often use satisfaction ratings, so to give something a rating from 1 to 10. So we can turn a lot of things into a countable, quantifiable metric. And that's very powerful because it's very quick to analyze that data. And it's also very quick for participants to record that kind of data. So that kind of quantitative approach is very useful, especially for large scale research when we want to talk and get the opinions of a lot of different people. It can also lead to much more generalizable findings. Because we've got a very large sample size, we can get to a level of statistical confidence, and that means that we're happy about applying findings from one particular sector to another one. Or at least if we're not, we understand to what level of confidence we are not satisfied to doing that, and what the level of variance could be. So those are some of the very strong arguments for taking quantitative approaches. Now, with the qualitative approaches, it's usually used for different questions. So I would say that qualitative approaches are often very useful for difficult topics and difficult questions. Questions that are not very well formulated, questions that sometimes we haven't really thought through properly, and questions which haven't been asked in the literature before. So questions which we're not really sure even sometimes how to word the question and what we're going to find. By the time you usually get to having a quantitative level of understanding of something, you usually know what the general trends are and you have a good idea what you expect to find. So often in those quantitative approaches, you would have a null hypothesis that you would seek to reject by doing a statistical test. And in a qualitative approach, what if you didn't have a null hypothesis? What if you had measured a phenomenon in society and you had no idea what might be causing it? Well, that would be the kind of difficult topic and the question formulation that you would want to see. You would also look at qualitative approaches if you're looking at subjective phenomena. So subjective phenomena would be something that's a very personal opinion or can be interpreted in very different complex ways. So how people feel about things like politics or particular politicians, that's a very subjective approach. And it doesn't often match onto a very rational or quantitative metric. And we can also have very complex phenomena about how we experience our world and how we experience our life that's very difficult to reduce to a single quantitative metric. So qualitative approaches, as I'm going to show, can be very powerful there as well. In general, we usually find qualitative approaches are better suited to smaller studies. So we look at a smaller sample size, so a smaller number of people, but in a greater level of depth. So we're asking research questions which are more suited to spending a long time to speak to a smaller number of people. When in a quantitative approach where we're looking for statistical significance, it's often better to speak to a lot of people, and because of the practicalities of the research time and the research budgets available, we can't speak to hundreds or thousands of people for a very long period of time. Now, for me, the power of qualitative inquiry could be illustrated best by a series of examples. I always try and change these up, and I'm going to talk about something which is kind of quite topical at the moment. So there's a lot of research recently which has been which is looking at transmission of COVID-19 and showing that face masks are an effective way to reduce the spread of the virus. And that's something which we've been able to show quantifiably. So we've been able to show it in lab situations. We've been able to show the mechanism and the effectiveness rate of different face masks and different types of face masks. And we've also been able to show that quantifiably at a population level. We can see, and an especially interesting example is in the United States, because in the United States, the regulations around face masks change in the different states. So essentially you have 50 different sample sizes of very large population groups, which all have either adopted face masks at a different time or have different regulations in how strict they're enforcing wearing face masks. But what that will quickly show you is that you can quantify the rate in which face masks limit the spread of the disease. But one of the other things which is very clear looking at the research coming out of the United States in particular is that a lot of people are hesitant, reluctant, or actively rebellious against wearing face masks. And this is something that all of those studies showing the quantitative benefits of wearing face masks can't really explain, can't really understand. Why do some people not want to wear face masks, taking even into account one particular culture in the United States? And there are a lot of qualitative studies which have started to look into it, and they show that there are a lot of different reasons that different people give for not wearing face masks. But they also illustrate that although people may say they have one particular reason for not wearing face masks, they may actually have a different reason, which is part of their own belief system, their own way of describing the world, and to a certain extent, their own ontology. And so that's the kind of thing that qualitative inquiry can unpack. Very complex social issues with very subjective and very varied answers. And I think that the power of qualitative inquiry combines, it's strongest when you're able to combine these two things. So we have the qualitative data, which may explain why some people are hesitant to use face masks, and that can be used to design interventions. And we also have the effectiveness rates based from quantitative studies, and that show us why face masks are effective and why we should be looking very carefully at the reasons that some people don't want to use them. So for me, the power is in bringing these two things together. So when would be a good time to use qualitative methods? I've touched basically on some of this, but I'll go through it again. So when the answer is complex, so for example, why don't people wear face masks? There's not one answer to that question. And the answers to that question vary depending on the population that you're talking to, the age range, the social demographic backgrounds of those people. So it's a very complex answer to seemingly what's quite a simple question. It's also very useful to use qualitative methods when you need to know why something. So again, in that same example, why do people not wear face masks? You could imagine eventually having a quantified study that basically shows 30% of people don't wear face masks because they believe it will cause them breathing difficulties. You could get to a certain level of statistical significance about those different answers. But when you don't know what those answers might be, when you don't understand the phenomenon at all, sometimes a small qualitative study talking in depth to a small number of people can illustrate why a particular phenomenon is happening and give you enough confidence that you understand the complex patterns happening there to design a larger, possibly mixed methods or possibly quantitative study. And you may also want to use qualitative methods when you don't know what question to ask, not even before the stage that you get to a quantitative metric, but where you're not even sure exactly how to formulate the question. So what you may show is actually a large number of people are still catching COVID-19 in areas where face masks are required. And that doesn't actually tell you that people aren't wearing face masks. And it doesn't tell you why people aren't wearing face masks. So it's something that helps you kind of formulate the initial question. So for me, those are the three main things: understanding why, formulating a question, and understanding complex issues. So when we start to think about what kinds of qualitative methods we can collect, it's useful to think about what those things would look like, what kinds of qualitative data we can collect and how, and what we would do with them. And also, what kinds of qualitative data would be best for particular types of studies. So speech is probably one of the most obvious. So talking to people, listening to people, people talking to each other, that's a very qualitative source of data because it's unstructured, because people generally don't speak in numbers and statistics. It is actually a qualitative source of data. So the types of methods that come from speech can be things like interviews and semi-structured interviews, and we'll talk about those in a little bit, and also focus groups. So in focus groups, you have people talk and engage with each other. And it's those interactions between different people that can help illuminate particular complex issues that they're talking about. So speech is a very important form of qualitative data. Now, there are different types of speech, and one of those, for example, might be social media. And social media is a form of speech, but it's also a source of qualitative data. So what people are talking about on social media, that's a form of qualitative data. And the exact wording that they use is a form of qualitative data. And it can be very interesting to analyze something, for example, people talking about face masks on social media, and see what reasons people are giving for adhering or not adhering to those regulations. So all kinds of social media could be relevant here. So you could be looking at something like Twitter or Facebook or WhatsApp, and And you can either use data which is already out there. So for example, you can look through Twitter quite easily and see everything that people are talking about face masks just by doing a search. You can collate that together and you can do qualitative analysis on that. So that would be a form of secondary data analysis on social media. And that's something which a lot of people are working on at the moment. But you can also use social media to elicit responses. So you can collect data through groups on WhatsApp, or you can ask people questions on an open forum like LinkedIn or Twitter when you ask a specific question, and you can get answers to that. And that might even generate debate and conversation going on into the social media. And that's all something you can analyze. So that would be a primary method of collecting data from social media. Now, there's also traditional media. So you might take something like newspapers, be it physical or online, but see what major journalists and major news sources are saying about things. And that doesn't mean just written sources. So it may also be in the radio and TV as well. And I think actually when I did this workshop a couple of years ago, we had someone that was looking a lot into particular representations in news media. And that's a very interesting thing, because I think a lot of the time how mainstream media presents different topics shows you a lot about the culture and the different things that people have expectations about the news, and what things are considered newsworthy or unusual or relevant for some reason. So traditional media analysis, that's all qualitative data. Now, where you can do quantitative studies on that kind of media as well. So for example, how many articles does a particular local newspaper have about a new development? It may be that you want to go beyond that and look not just at the number of articles or the amount of coverage. So sometimes column inches are used as a reference to show how long articles are on a particular topic. But you'd also want to see what they're saying. Are they saying something positive about this development? Are they saying something negative? Is there a balance? And that can be very illuminating, just in terms of not just what is being said, but how that represents different sources of media, one particular newspaper more positive than another. And that would be some kind of sentiment analysis. So something quantitative and qualitative that you can pull out from doing media analysis. So that can be a very useful source of qualitative data too. And then another source of qualitative data, which a lot of people don't think about as a source of data, is actually journal articles and textbooks. And these papers are also a source of qualitative data. And I'll talk a little bit later on about how useful a qualitative approach can be for doing systematic and literature reviews, even on quantitative topics. So remember that articles and journals, textbooks, these can all be sources of qualitative data too. They're all sources of unstructured data that we can analyze. So what I'm going to do now is just step back for a little bit and look at an example paper. It's quite a random one I found, but I wanted to have something which had some kind of connection to tourism and hospitality, took a very kind of conventional mainstream qualitative approach, but very clearly showed the benefits of that qualitative approach. And this is quite a recent paper in quite a good journal of Travel and Tourism Marketing. And this is looking basically at Japanese tourists, so elderly Japanese tourists, and looking at the reasons that they want to go to particular countries and why they go on holidays and why they go on group holidays especially. And you can imagine the utility of this, and the full paper is there. And when I send these slides around, you can look at the full paper. It's quite well written. It's quite easy reading, even if you don't have a qualitative background. So it's quite a good example for this. But you can imagine the authors finding a quantitative phenomenon. So they're examining patterns of tourism in a particular country, and they see that there are a large number of tourists that come from Japan. And a lot of Japanese tourists tend to be older, they tend to be retired. So that's a quantitative metric. We can show, you know, the absolute numbers or the relative proportions of tourists to a particular area that are coming from Japan. But that doesn't really tell us why they're coming. It doesn't tell us what kinds of trips they might choose. And if you're a tourism or marketing board, it wouldn't tell you how to appeal to those particular groups of tourists, which you know are a very important source of revenue. So this paper basically says, yes, we know there are a lot of tourists coming from Japan. They tend to be older. let's try and find out what the reasons are that they go on so many holidays. And so they have, the first phase of this study was basically a survey. So they did a mixed method survey. So there were quantitative stuff they were counting in there, especially around demographics, and also a very short survey giving them some of the ideas about the kinds of reasons that people might want to go on holiday for. And then they used that. So it says, based on the results of the first phase, the second phase provided a more in-depth analysis. And this is a very common approach in qualitative research design, to have something which is a kind of a very wide, broad overview based on original piece of data or existing known quantitative phenomenon, and then choose and match it with an in-depth approach to understand that phenomenon better. So here their motivations were associated with the desire to create new relationships through tourism. So that's interesting. That's one of the things they found in the first depth, that creating relationships was a very important reason why people went on these holidays. In other words, the purpose of this phase was to identify the themes inherent in older individuals' motivation to meet older people through tourism. Therefore, we conducted in-depth interviews with 25 individuals who indicated in the survey that their motivation to travel was related to human relationships. So in the first phase of this research design, they found an interesting phenomenon that they didn't understand. They found that most people were going on holidays to make friends. And they didn't understand why they would do that. And they didn't understand the rationale behind that. So out of, I think it was about if I remember rightly, 200 or 300 surveys, they chose 25 people who completed that survey and said that going on holiday was important for them because they met new friends. And then they did an in-depth interview. So that would be something that we would call sometimes a semi-structured interview. So they met them probably face-to-face, possibly in an informal setting like a cafe, or a more formal setting like an interview room in the university. And then they basically asked them a series of questions that were open-ended. So they didn't want yes or no questions. In this type of qualitative interviews, you asked open-ended questions like, what are your motivations for going on holiday? And then you prompt the respondents to give you a long, detailed answer. And you're also listening to those answers very intently as you're doing this qualitative interviewing, and listening for anything that's unusual or strange or interesting, and then asking the person to elaborate more. So you very rarely have a set question list that you're asking to every person that you talk to. You're trying to see what's different for every person, and you're trying to understand that individual's motivations. And that's exactly what they did in this particular topic. We employed unstructured interviews based on free discussions without a predetermined set of questions, because they didn't understand why going on holiday to make friends was so important for this group of people. So this is a very typical approach, 25 individuals. So again, based from the quantitative survey, which I think I had 200 or 300 respondents, they've chosen a very small sample. And if you come from a quantitative background, speaking to 25 people is not going to give you statistical significance or confidence on very much that you're going to find, especially when you're giving free discussions to all these people. They may not talk about the same factor twice. Everybody may talk about something different. So you're not going to have a very sure level that you're going to find a common theme there. But on the other hand, you may find a common theme there that you'd never thought of before. And that's the benefit of this open-ended approach. So let's look a little bit about the process that they use to explore and analyze that data now that they've collected those interviews. So they had them transcribed. So they had audio recordings of those interviews, and then they typed them up word for word, or had a service to type them up word for word. And then it says, firstly, we became familiar with the data by listening to each tape in its entirety several times, along with transcripts and field notes. So again, this is a very common approach to qualitative data. Because it's so rich and so detailed and varied, what they really need to do here is understand all of the different things that might come up through the interviews. So they listened several times to 25 interviews. I would imagine that most of these, they don't explicitly say, are probably about an hour long. So they're spending something like at least 50 hours just listening to the interviews, reading the transcripts, reading their field notes. So those are the notes from the interviewer themselves, to try and understand the very broad overview of the patterns emerging from the data. And then it says their second stage, we systematically generated the initial code. I believe they mean initial codes here, by selecting frequent and interesting features from interview transcripts. So in that process of listening to the interviews over and over again, they were able to identify things that were coming up all the time. And those were sometimes called themes or codes. So those were things that lots of people were saying, and you can categorize as being on the same topic. So maybe one of the reasons was loneliness. So a lot of these people felt lonely. So a very common theme might be loneliness. And then you would go through and you would systematically look through the interviews and find all the examples of where someone was talking about loneliness. And then by tagging those together, you can read not just the story of an individual, but the story of a theme, the story of loneliness. What are all the different people saying about loneliness? And how common is that? Is that something everybody's talking about? And you would find lots of other themes as well. So loneliness might not be part of it. Part of it might be excitement. Part of it might be risk-taking. Part of it might be exploring your horizons. Part of it might be people who weren't feeling lonely, but just wanted a wider social group. Part of it may be that they wanted to meet people across the country in different places. So all of these might be themes that you would want to explore and systematically look through the data. And then it says, thirdly, we categorize codes according to broader themes, identifying common themes that united several discrete codes with relevant meanings. So I gave that example of loneliness. So that might be something that is also a theme together with social isolation. It may also be a theme with possibly bereavement. So if there are a lot of people that have had a partner die at a late age and they're suddenly feeling very lonely. So there are lots of things under the broader topic of loneliness or social isolation that you might bring together in a wider theme. And again, this is a very common approach. So to identify first the smaller themes and codes, and then bring them together into groups and topics that help to explain the research question. So let's look at an example of how they've presented the data in this paper, because I think that's another one of the things that's often a bit strange for people coming from a quantitative background. If you were writing a quantitative paper, you would have methods and you would have results, and you present an R-squared value, you present a p-value, and that's how you would present your data. But on the other hand, in this quantitative data, it's much more complex and it's much more in depth. And there is a clear need to present basically extracts of the data that illustrate some of the main things you're finding. And that's an approach that most qualitative papers will take. So here in the results and discussion section, this is what they say. Older Japanese tourists perceive tourism as a satisfactory way to meet new people and thus help them remain socially engaged. So we talked about social engagement. And what they've got below here is two quotes. So these are directly the words that were said by two different participants that illustrate that theme they found. So Mrs. W says, many people travel to find new people whilst traveling. You might consider it the best reason to travel, finding people and friends. So that's obviously about meeting new people. Next one, people join tours because they enjoy meeting people, don't they? If they didn't like it, they would travel alone. Meeting is really fun. The reason to take a trip is to meet people. So this is really interesting. So we've got two examples here, and they might not be illustrative of everyone, but they show very strongly for these two people, they're not interested in seeing interesting archaeological sites. They're not interested in food in foreign countries. They're interested in meeting people. That's the primary reason that they're going on these holidays. And although the researchers have been through and identified this as a theme across most of the interviews, which the people that they spoke to, they're basically demonstrating and validating that by giving some examples, some direct quotes from the participants. So not phrases they made up themselves, but exactly what the people said. And that's how they're illuminating the way that they've coded and analyzed that data. And then what they've done, I know, I'm sorry that the image is a little small here, but on the left side of the screen here, what they've done is they've used this to actually develop a model. So they've developed a model for the reasons for travel. And basically, they've come together to say two things. So what they found is that a lot of these people have a very boring, ordinary life. There's very little opportunities for social engagement. But travel provides the opportunity for an extraordinary setting. So the reason is twofold. First of all, people find their existing lives boring. And second of all, they see travel as a way to, especially socially, widen those horizons. So they've put these findings together to create a model. And this could be a model that they then go on to test more with more in-depth qualitative measures or quantitatively, now that they've got a pattern and an understanding of the phenomenon that they want to explore. So again, I've provided the link for this paper. If it's of any interest to you, you can have a look through it. You may even have seen it already. It's a very widely cited paper, but it's a nice example of one qualitative method and some of the ways that that can be used to explore the phenomena. So this paper that we looked at is talking about qualitative methods, and it's talking about interviews. They use semi-structured interviews. They also use a survey in the provisional field. So interviews and also focus groups, so those are kind of group discussions, two of the most commonly used qualitative methods. I think they're commonly used because they are very easy for participants to get involved with. People know how to talk to each other. They know how to talk to an interviewer. They know how to talk to each other. So it's a natural setting usually to record data. It's also very easy to set up. It doesn't require a lot of planning, a lot of foresight, and it's an opportunity to give very rich data. We're very used to, chatting with friends and family. And the best interviews, I think, feel like an informal chat with a friend. So you're free to talk as much as you like on a particular topic and just say whatever that you think is relevant. A second group of qualitative methods is observation and ethnography. And that's often actually just watching people. So often watching people in a particular setting. So it might be a setting at work, it may be a setting like in a hotel, and it may be seeing what kinds of things they do. In that stage, the data may actually be video recordings or audio recordings, but it's often the notes taken from the researcher. So they would write down the things they see and anything that might explain the patterns that they see. A lot of these methods come under a kind of broader qualitative approach of ethnography. And there's a lot of different ethnographic methods that you can draw on there as well. There are also surveys and diaries. So the survey was one of the things in the example paper above. They did a large kind of qualitative survey. So it had mixed methods. I mean, it had open-ended and it had discrete quantitative questions, but it's a very quick way and a very common way. People are very used to filling in surveys, so it's easy for participants to engage for that. And especially when you want to capture data from a larger number of people, survey can be very useful. Doing something kind of similar in a more in-depth way, I'm a big fan of doing diary methodology. So these are elicited diaries. So you ask someone to keep a diary about something. So the tourism example above, we may find our 25 participants, we may send them on holiday and we may give them a diary and say, every day, can you write about the social experiences that you have on your holiday? And what that would do is give you something a little bit like an ethnographic method, so an observation, but through the eyes of the participant themselves. So what kind of social things they were doing and why, what things they chose to engage with and why. And when you went back and you read all those diaries together, you may get a really good understanding of why people are behaving in a particular way. There are also creative methods, and these may be, these can be very open-ended. But a lot of people will use something called photo voice. So that's getting people to take pictures of something they're doing. So you may get people in this example to take pictures while they're on holiday. And one of the things you may find is what they take pictures of is, not a beautiful castle or a fantastic landscape, but the people that they meet. And then that would very quickly show you the importance of the social aspect of that kind of tourism. You may give them a video camera to record videos. A lot of people are doing research on Snapchat or TikTok now, getting people to record their own little vignettes. And you can also use art approaches as well. So you can get people to draw things. You can do mapping exercises. Tell me the important things about the place where you live. And then you can also use mixed methods. So mixed methods technically doesn't actually mean just quantitative and qualitative together. It means mixing any kinds of methods. So you may do some interviews and focus groups. It's an extremely common pairing. You may do some surveys and interviews, as our example paper did. And you may do some creative methods like the getting people to take pictures of their holiday combined with the diaries. That would be a really neat combination of methods. And that would tell you different things together. But of course, a lot of mixed methods research is integrating qualitative and quantitative data. And we'll talk about some of the challenges of doing that right now. So the benefits of mixed methods is that you can bring these different types of data together, and they can be a very powerful combination, as I said already. Now, sometimes people would do mixed methods in different stages. So you may do some quantitative research first to basically give you a kind of broad overview. And then you use a qualitative measure to get a more in-depth understanding from a small subset of people. But you may also do it the other way around. So you may start with a small qualitative study, talking to a few people, to make sure that you're asking the right questions and understanding the phenomenon the better before you do a larger survey or a quantitative method. So mixed methods can work both ways round. And they can also be done in parallel. So a lot of studies, and it kind of feels like the example study was something where things were going on in parallel. So they were doing the quantitative survey, mixed method survey, at the same time they were doing the qualitative interviews. The challenge with these mixed methods is what's often called triangulation. So that's trying to bring two very discrete data sources together to answer a common question and to back up a finding. So how would you have a quantitative method for social isolation that's then backed up by your qualitative metric? And that's one of the challenges when choosing your methods. You need to be able to justify why you've chosen methods so that they can come together and that you can actually have them back each other up. And that's a huge challenge. Now, once we've decided on our design and our plan, the next thing to do is to talk about how we do that analysis process. So in that example, we talked a little bit about it, but the challenge with qualitative data is it's so rich, it's so diverse, it's so interesting and has so much depth. We want a method of analysis that preserves that. So there's a couple of different ways of doing qualitative analysis, and the challenges are always based around working with a large volume of data. Now, you may find that statement surprising if we're only talking about interviewing 25 people, where we did a survey with 200. But my argument would be that if we interviewed 200 people and asked them 20 questions that were yes, no, or 1 to 10, it would actually be very quick to bring that data together. But where we've got 25 people that have just spoken ad lib for an hour, that presents a very large volume of data, often hundreds and thousands of words to analyze. And what we want to do is not just reduce all of that to a couple of key quotes, but to have some way of capturing the diversity and the depth and the richness that's in that data. And we want to be able to bring that back to the research question. So we're actually answering the question we set out in the first place. So to my mind, most methods of qualitative analysis are about reading data in different ways. In that example, we talked about people were reading, they literally were listening to the interviews while reading the transcripts over and over again. But the different methods of analysis also help us read the data in different ways. So when we find key themes such as loneliness or social isolation, we can read across the data sets. So we read things which are illuminating about isolation. We read things which are interesting about loneliness. And that gives us a different way to read across rather than down. And we can also compare across the sources. So we read across and say, okay, well, these particular group of people are saying something different to this particular group of people. Do the women in this study have different rationales from the men? Are they talking about it in different ways? So analysis often helps us read differences across the different data sets. A lot of the time we'll take some kind of approach which is based on thematic or content analysis. Although they go into more detail this in the example paper, this was one of the approaches they took. They were looking for themes in the data. So a theme was socialization and loneliness. It was something that helped explain the data and something that was common across a lot of the different sources. We may also look at discourse analysis. So discourse analysis is a way to look to see what people are saying and how they're saying it. So we're looking at the language they're using, We're looking at the words they choose to describe things, because that can be extremely illuminating to show especially a lot of hidden things and things that people aren't necessarily conscious of themselves. We can also do narrative analysis. So a lot of times interviewing someone will tell a story, part of their life story that explains their rationale. So people will have a story about why they feel lonely. They'll have a story which explains why they choose to go on group holidays. And developing a narrative for one person, or a common narrative that applies to a lot of people, is a really useful way of exploring qualitative data. And there are dozens of other ways. So different types of coding. So we can do interpretive phenomenological analysis. We can use grounded theory or inductive reasoning or inductive coding. There are so many different approaches that we don't have time to go in them here, but I'm going to give you a link which will give you a lot more details. But basically, these are all different ways of reading the data differently. The coding is one process which is part of the analysis cycle that really helps us to manage this unstructured qualitative data. In qualitative coding, we're often taking a thematic or content-based approach to start with. We're identifying these codes or themes or topics. And then once we know the things that we want to look for in the data, we read through all of the data and we tag specific quotes, specific highlights, specific bits of the data that are about those particular codes. And then what we do is we compare those. So we can read the whole code together, everything about loneliness, or we can read across the different sources, so everything a particular group of people said, and then we can identify patterns and trends in that. Now, a lot of the time, people will do coding using paper-based methods. So probably the most common one is to use printed out transcripts and then highlighters with a different color representing the different themes or the different codes. And that way you can read through, mark out with a highlighter the particular things, red for isolation, yellow for excitement. And then you can very quickly read through all the different things by color. Some people also use post-it notes, so they will annotate the data as well, putting in their own comments and thoughts alongside the transcripts. But we can also use software to do this. So quercus is an example of a qualitative software package. There's lots of others you might have heard of out there: NVivo, MaxQDA, Atlas TI, Deduce, etc. But these basically do a very similar thing. Their job is to help you keep all the data together. So bring in all of those transcripts, all those sources of data, keep all of those codes and themes that you have together, and then match them. So you're able to see from all the sources, all the different bits of text and data that you want to pull out. This is often called computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software. And what that is basically a database in the computer which helps you manage the data sources. So those are the interviews that you may have done, or the focus groups, or whatever. And also you have a series of tools there to help you create the codes, to assign data to those codes, and then explore and visualize that data. Now, it's also important to note some of the limitations of using software. It's not an automatic process. One of the problems with qualitative data is that there are so many different things that you want to explore in that data. The software itself can't really understand the topics and the themes. So you can't at the moment just press the button on your computer and have it come back and write a report for you, complete with qualitative examples. You have to create the codes, and then you have to decide even which bits of text belong into those codes. With a lot of qualitative in-depth data, the nuances are so subtle that the computer can't pick up on them at the moment. They always work better when you have a plan for how you're going to use them. You're not using the software because it's there. You've got a very clear idea of what you're going to do with the software, how you're going to structure your data, how you're going to structure your codes, and then how that's going to help you with your analysis, and then lead into your writing up process. Always remember that analysis should lead into writing up whatever your source is, be it a thesis, be it a textbook, be it a monograph or a journal paper. There are also a lot of people who claim that qualitative software can make people distanced from the data. They don't really see the depth and the richness of it. And it can also lead to quantification. So you become a little bit too obsessed with how many quotes you have under one particular code. Maybe that means that that code or theme is more important than another. Both of those things are not true if the software is used properly, I feel. And that's one of the things about planning for the use of the software, is to make sure that you don't have feature creep. You don't start to use it for more than is appropriate for qualitative approach. So There's a free trial for quercus, which will give you a lot more information about how it works. But basically the process with quercus, we designed it to be very simple, very easy to use. And it uses a very visual interface. So the codes and the themes are shown as these bubbles, and they grow as you add more text to them. So you kind of get an overview all the time and a live visualization of what data is coming up from your interviews, your transcripts. We try to make it very quick to learn and also very affordable. You'll find it's one of the cheapest packages out there. There's also lots of different ways to manage the sources you bring in there. You can describe them with properties, and that may be basic things like demographics, so age and gender and location. And then you can use that to filter and sort through the different results and see side-by-side comparisons of different parts of your data. You can also, of course, generate visualizations. Some of them are shown here, and reports, which give you a lot more detail into what's going on. And we now have a cloud-based system for quercus where the data is stored remotely. It means that you can access the data across any device, or a laptop or a desktop, and your data is always there, just like using OneDrive or iCloud or something like that. But it also allows for live collaboration. So if you've got a group working with lots of different people together, you can all work on the data at the same time. You can chat in real time, and you can share projects with each other. And it's also a really useful way of learning qualitative analysis. So sharing different data sources between yourselves and seeing and watching as someone else goes through and doing the coding. So there's a free trial available here. And I'm very happy to give an extension to the free trial for anyone watching, so anyone who's part of the group. I'm sure Harim will give you more detail about that. Also wanted to mention, just as a kind of closing point, I've covered a lot of things which are very complex, very briefly. So a couple of slides for things that some people would spend a whole semester learning. There are lots of really good resources out there. Kind of a start, 160 articles on all kinds of different things. So different methods of analysis, tips for doing qualitative interviews, tips for doing different kinds of analysis, tips for managing data, tips for collecting good data, and a lot more detail about the different ways that you can code and analyze the data. So hopefully that's a good starting point. It's got lots of references and examples, which will help you go further and learn to a level of depth where you feel confident about doing some of these approaches. So that's all I had for this kind of very brief overview. I know it's been a bit of a whirlwind, a bit of a rush, but I hope it's been a useful, at least teaser, and get you kind of interested in the potential for qualitative methods. Yeah, and I would now like to open up for any questions.